Chapter 14 Worshipped and Stoned A splendid road was under their feet as they left Antioch. It was an imperial road, one more in the many links of the chain that bound the nations around the Great Sea to the throne of the Mistress of the world. Slaves and convicts, nearly half a century before Paul and Barnabas passed, had dug out the earth through the whole length of this road. They had quarried, carted, smashed, thrown in, and hammered down 3 layers of stone. Then, with ring of chisel and thud of mallet, they had paved the surface with closely fitting stone, the whole road being curved to throw off water into side trenches. This road on which Paul and Barnabas strode southeastwards gleamed there in the spring sunshine. The robbers in the hills saw the road and trembled. Down that road the Roman legionaries swiftly marched, sword at hip and shield on arm. The brazen eagle on the Roman standard soared from the road up among the fastnesses of the robbers in the almost trackless mountain range on their left, defying even the crags where the vultures swooped for their prey. The road was the mark of Rome. It was the line along which she hurled the legions that kept over all the world at that day, from Britain to the Euphrates, the greatest quiet that the world has ever known, the Pax Romana. It was along the road that Rome, the Queen of the 7 Hills, sent her messages to her people. Ahead of them on the road they could see a small city, Neapolis. On reaching this place, Paul and Barnabas found that at the chief caravansary not only could such travellers as themselves get food and lodging, but men could shelter their beasts in the spacious stables or hire relays of horses for swift long-distance travel. A wild clatter of hoofs and a shout was heard. Then sweating horses were reined up, and bags taken from their backs. The Roman post that linked all the world up with the imperial government had ridden in from the cities of the eastern plain. All was bustle as the ostlers led fresh horses out. The leather bags were strapped across their backs with another bag, into which bread and olives and a score of dried figs were stuffed. The fresh horses pawed the paved way in their eagerness to start, which was satisfied to the full as the men of the Roman post, with their armed guard, mounted, and with cracking whips thundered on westward through Antioch down the Lycus valley to Ephesus, where they shipped across the Aegean and the Adriatic to Brundisium, and so galloped up the Appian Way into Rome itself. Paul, as he saw the Dauntless road bridging from east to west, and heard the departing clatter of the horses' hoofs, felt growing in him a boundless ambition for his good news, that it too should bridge from east to west, should be spread from end to end of that road, that he himself, Paul, should be God's imperial post who would ride the road from end to end delivering the word. So Paul and Barnabas pressed on eastward, passing caravans of laden camels coming up from the distant sea of the Greek islands and cities, and meeting others coming down from the far-off sea of the desert, from Persia and even Paul's own old birthplace, Tarsus. At last they came to a fork where the great road went on eastward, but a branch ran north over the shoulder of 2 twin peaks that stood out against the skyline. Turning up this branch road, they climbed the side of the hill and, at a curve in the road, came out in sight of a great plain. In the midst of it, still far away, was a walled city. It was Iconium, though Paul, as he stood on the height and looked at the city, must have thought of the day when, from another ridge, he looked down on Damascus. For Iconium, like Damascus, lay in a plain of lovely orchards, flanked by mountains on the west watered by a river running out from mountains, and, in each case, the river then lost itself in the earth. Iconium and Damascus share the honour of being the oldest cities in the world that are still standing. They will always live, for they are the first places where men find water after long distances of arid country. They are ports of the desert. Down the hill and across the flat, by the streams and canals that carried the melted snow water and the spring rains in among the orchards, the road brought them at length into Iconium. Though the 2 comrades had travelled some 90 miles from Antioch in Pisidia, they were still in the great region over which Antioch ruled. As they walked through the streets of Iconium, they noticed that there were not so many Roman officials and soldiers as in Antioch. Both Antioch and Iconium were Roman cities, where Greek was spoken except by the poorer and the country people, but Antioch was a great governing city, while Iconium was a place of commerce where many traders came and went from all over the east and west to do business. Out among the hills, where the men dug in the copper and the quicksilver mines, was the temple of the Earth Mother, whom all the people in the plain worshipped. She dwelt in the earth, they thought, and sent them the precious metals, the river that sprang from the hills, and the harvest out of the ground. The Greeks taught the people of Iconium to worship her as Athene, the conquering goddess, but they still worshipped her really as the Earth Mother with her companion Snake, who came out of the earth to do her bidding. Paul and Barnabas went into the synagogue on the Sabbath, just as they had done at Antioch, to speak about Jesus. So powerfully did they both speak that a great number of people, both the Jews and the Greeks, believed that what they said was true. But some of the Jews utterly refused to accept the story. "These travelling fellows," we can almost hear them saying, "are just lying for their own ends, with their wild legend about this Christ who died on a Roman cross, like those wretched robbers nailed up at the crossroads over the plain there. The blasphemy of saying such a one could rise again." There was a great deal of communication between Antioch and Iconium, so it would be very likely that some trader or official who had come to Iconium from Antioch would say, "What, are those wretches here? Why, we chased them out of Antioch for a disturbing couple of meddlers. Why don't you do the same?" Those Jews, who loathed Paul and Barnabas and all their words and works, exasperated the people in the marketplace and all over the city against the two comrades. The whole place began to be in a fever of excitement, some crying, "Stone them!" though not quite sure for what reason, except that they were two outsiders. But others said, "Why, what harm have they done?" But the fever of hate grew hotter. The people began to come on with menaces and mutterings against them. So Paul and Barnabas quickly escaped and started out across the plain. All day they walked, the road gradually rising till they found themselves on a long ridge of rock looking down on a broad valley through which a beautiful stream ran. On the horizon southeastward they saw the line of the Taurus mountains. Dropping down the road from the ridge to the valley they saw a compact city built around and on a little hill. The stream ran past two sides of the city, which was called Lystra. They were back again now on the road from which, you remember, they had branched off to go to Iconium. And Lystra was, like Antioch, a Roman colony, a centre of government from which the orders of Rome were issued and her authority exercised. It was, however, smaller, more remote, and newer than Antioch. In front of the main gate of the city, near which the river flowed, was a fine temple to Zeus, the chief of the gods, where bulls were sacrificed by white-robed priests. There was a prophetic legend in Lystra that some day Zeus himself, with his messenger Hermes, would come and visit the city. Paul and Barnabas went in through the gate into the streets of the city, where they stayed for some time. One day Paul was speaking out in the open air. Crowds of people had gathered to listen to him. There happened to be sitting there a man powerless in his feet, a lame man who had been unable to walk since he was born. This man heard Paul speaking, and was listening to him with rapt attention. Paul looked at the lame man and could see, from the utter confidence in his eyes, that the man had faith enough to make him better. Paul therefore stopped his speech, turned to the man, looked at him with that eager, compelling gaze of his, and said, in a loud voice, "Stand erect on your feet." He jumped up and began to walk. The crowd of Lystrans could not for the moment believe their eyes. This was no wandering beggar who had pretended to be lame. He was one of their own people whom they knew to be a cripple. They began to shout out in a strange language that Paul did not understand, the speech of their country, the Lycaonian language, "The gods have come down to us as men." Zeus was the greatest of the gods, and the Eastern people think of the silent, immovable man as the potentate. Hermes was his spokesman, his swift-flying, ready-tongued messenger. So they named the quiet, gracious Barnabas Zeus, and Paul, the orator, they called Hermes. Paul and Barnabas saw a great stir going on, and put it down simply to the natural effect of the wonder of healing the cripple. But soon they heard the lowing of oxen, and saw them all garlanded being led along toward the great temple of Zeus in front of the gate. The truth flashed on them. The people thought they were gods, mistook them for the very gods whose worship Paul's preaching would sweep away. When the Eastern wishes to show his utter grief, he will tear his robe. At the sight of the priests and the oxen, Paul and Barnabas seized their robes and rent them from neck to hem, and sprang out among the people, shouting at the top of their voices, "Men, what is this you are doing? We are men, with natures like your own. The good news we have come to tell you is that you should turn from such futile ways to the living God, who made the heaven, the earth, the sea, and all that is in them. In bygone days he allowed all the nations to go their own ways, though, as the bountiful giver, he did not leave himself without witnesses. For he gave you rain from heaven and fruitful seasons, giving you food and joy to your heart's content." Try as they would with words and gestures, they could hardly stop the people from sacrificing the oxen to them. At last the oxen were turned back, the garlands taken off, the priests put aside their sacrificial robes, and all was quiet once more. Some time after this more travelling Jews came into the city of Lystra. A number from Antioch along the main road, others from Iconium. No sooner did they find that Paul and Barnabas were at Lystra than they began to work up an agitation against them. With crafty speech they went in and out among the simpler people, working on their unthinking passions, their dislike of strange teaching and new people. A man who knows how to work on the mind of a mob can always work up an Oriental crowd into a frenzy to stone a stranger. "Stone Paul!" was the cry that went from lip to lip. So as he went into the street in Lystra, threading his way among the people, the flame of hate caught fire. "Stone him!" shouted someone, and in a moment the air was thick with missiles. The recollection of his healing of a cripple was wiped out in the hail of hate. They beat him to the ground, and then, stunned by a well-aimed stone, he lay senseless on the earth. "Out of the city with the body!" was the next cry. Gripping him under the arms, they dragged Paul along and out under the city gateway, past the very temple where they had prepared, only a short while before, to worship him and Barnabas, and flung him out in the sun. End of chapter 14.